there we go. So here, we have 2 half square triangles. There's tons of patterns that you can do with half square triangles. And for today, like I used all different fabrics. Like I wasn't keeping in any kind of theme or color scheme, but that is another option that you can do.
So for those of you who don't know Chris, he is a Sewing Parts Online ambassador. He's a Grace ambassador. He is a creator of community. And you know what I found out about Chris the other day? I found out he was on the news a little while back. I didn't know about that. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, I had a segment on Good Day Oregon, so local news, but I forget which news station they're affiliated with. That was last summer. The news crew actually came to my house in my tiny little studio. So it was me, the reporter, who was amazing, and the cameraman with this gigantic camera. Like, I don't know how we managed it in this tiny little space, but it was a lot of fun.
That's awesome. Yeah, I don't even know. I think I searched your name in YouTube because I was looking for something on your patterns or something. Oh, I was looking for your shirt tutorial because Deb and I are making shirts for me. And then the first result was the news, and I was like, what? I didn't even know about this. So that's pretty awesome. Also, I'm gonna let you describe what your segment's about and take it away, but really quickly, do you want to plug your community quilt, the thing you do?
Those of you that don't follow me, I'm Chris with Rose City Originals. This year I am doing a project. It started on January 1st and I am hoping to be done by December 31st. But I'm making a community quilt, and it is made up of all fabrics from my viewers. So I've received fabric from all over the world. Germany, Japan, England, Ireland, Australia, like everywhere. It's amazing. And I am making random blocks with the fabric submission. I just posted, I think the last 3 days, my videos have been for the community quilt. So you can go check that out on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, or Facebook. And it's just a lot of fun. It's completely random. I have zero control over it. It's kind of a chaotic mess, but it's really cool looking.
It kind of reminds me of that thing that Reddit does every few years. They do that pixel where everybody can go place their own tile in the pixel, and then it just becomes utter chaos, but somehow it's really cool in the end. It reminds me of that. But anyway, so I'm going to let you explain to us what crumb quilting is, get into your segment, and then whenever you need me, let me know. We'll talk about your patterns and stuff, okay?
Okay. And I won't need you to do any camera switches today. I got that all under control.
Awesome.
All right, so today we're talking about crumb quilting, and a lot of people may not know what that is. When you're done with a project, you tend to have some scraps left over. It could be, large scraps that are totally usable. You can set them aside for your next project, or you may end up with really small pieces. These in the quilting world are typically known as crumbs. It's the crumbs that are left after you're done with your main project. So these, for many quilters, can become a problem because they pile up. And after so many quilts, you just have a ton of these. You feel bad throwing them away. Like, it's still technically usable fabric, but what do you do with it? So today I'm going to show you how you can turn these scraps into usable fabric, and then what you can do with that usable fabric. So I just pulled a very small sampling of scraps. Underneath my table here, I have 9 buckets with it all color coordinated, and some of them are overflowing. So I need to do some scrap projects here pretty quick. As you're sorting your scraps, things you're going to look for is you want stuff that's about 1 inch wide or larger. And the reason for that is if I were to sew, say this, let's see how much that is. That's about 1/2 inch. If I were to sew 1/4 inch on either side of this, I'd have nothing left. Nothing would show on my final piece. So unfortunately, these are destined for the recycling. I'm lucky enough in my area to have a service that actually does textile recycling. It's called Ridwell for anyone who's in the Pacific Northwest. They are starting to branch out, but you can see if there's something like that in your area. If it's 100% cotton, you can also throw this in your compost bin. That's one thing you can do with it. You can use it to stuff animals. I will caution against stuffing pet beds. I've heard from some veterinarians recently that they've had to do many unfortunate extractions from animals who have ingested small fabric scraps. So just something to be aware of. But using it for stuffing a teddy bear or something is really good. So you can go through and sort your scraps, get the ones that you think are going to be a little more usable, pull those out. And then we are just going to start sewing. Today I'm going to show you 3 main techniques for making your crumb pieces, and then what you can do with it. So we'll just pull a couple random pieces out here. And what you really want to do is make sure that you have at least 1 straight side. So right here for this piece, I'm going to cut it so that I have a straight side to sew against. And these are actually scraps left over from another crumb piecing project. So your crumbs can pretty much live on in forever. When I'm done today, I'll probably have an inch or so left off the edges. I can use that in my next project. It keeps cycling through, which is really fun with this. So for my first technique, we are just going to kind of freehand it. So I'm going to start with this piece. Here's a solid piece. I can sew it onto this edge. And you can do this either being color coordinated or completely random. Now I still have several inches here left over of this fabric. So I can, while I'm here, just chain in another piece. And when I reach the end of that one, I can do even another piece. Let's use this one. So we have these 3 pieces sewn onto our original piece. And what we need to do is separate them. So I'm just going to use my scissors. You can also use your rotary cutter. With this, because it's all kind of freehand, I don't mind using my scissors because we're not really going for precision or perfection. Now we are going to want to iron these flat as we go. And I do just iron it to the side. If you watch any of my videos, you'll see I often press my seams open, but with crumb piecing, it tends to be easier just to press them to one side. And I will say, just press to the side that it wants to go to. Don't worry about light and dark. This is all going to be kind of chaotic in the end. But the side that doesn't have any seams is typically how it's going to want to lie anyway. Right here, neither of the sides have a direct seam butting up to it, so it can go either way. And then this one I'll press this way. All right, so now we have these 3 really weird looking pieces. And what we'll do is just continue sewing more to it. So I'll use this as my new strip. When I get to the end, I can sew this piece on. And you can sew it on either, the long end or the short end. It really doesn't matter. In the end, it's really what look you're going for with your piece. If you want it to be lots of really small pieces, if you're okay with larger pieces. But let me show you this. All right, let's say I don't want a lot of really large pieces in my finished design. I really want to go for a really busy, small pieces, have it be really interesting. But I just sewed these together, and this is a really big piece. Let me free it from the rest of this. So what I can do is press this to the side. And then just cut it. You can cut it straight across. You can cut it at a slight angle. You want it to just be a fairly straight line so that you can sew your next piece onto it, though. Sew this onto here. And really, you could just have fun. Grab random scraps. I've heard people of doing like a brown bag challenge. So you put all of your scraps into a bag that you cannot see. And you just grab the next piece, and that's what you're sewing on. So you have no control over, trying to match colors or patterns or anything like that. One piece of advice I will give when doing crumb piecing is to shorten your stitch length, because you're going to be cutting through those seams you're making. If your stitch length is really big, you may have an issue with your pieces coming apart as you're working with it. You don't want that to happen. So a shorter stitch length will be your friend. This project is also something that's really good if you have a bunch of bobbins that have just a little bit of thread left on them and just weird colors. Maybe you were working on a project and you had bright orange thread in your bobbin, and now you have half a bobbin of orange thread. You can use that because you're using all scrap fabric anyway. Nothing's matching. So you can use up those little bits and ends of bobbins rather than them just sitting there collecting dust or eventually just unwinding them and tossing that thread. So it's very eco-friendly. As you go along, you will end up with spots where there's just a bunch of seams and it's kind of bulky. That's, you know, one of the downfalls of crumb piecing, but you can work through it. It's not too big a deal. If it starts to get too bulky, you can also switch to using your walking foot to help get over some of those humps. We just go along, and this is just going to get larger and larger and larger as we go. Now, some people, some friends of mine, they'll just sit and make crumb pieces, just whatever size they end up being, and then they'll put those aside to use for a project later. I like to have somewhat of a plan, knowing what I'm going to be doing with this crumb piece. So for today, I'm just going to make a few half square triangles, and I need about a 6.5 inch square. So this is big enough to do that, but I have this big yellow spot here and like some fairly big areas. So if I do my half square triangle, part of it's going to just be yellow with a little bit of some other fabric. So that's a little bit big for me. So I'm going to just cut it right here and continue adding in more fabric. I'll grab some of these leftover bits from some other crumb projects. Straighten off this edge just to give me some little bit of variety. Now, as you're doing this method, just kind of freehanding it, it's really easy to end up with some pretty bizarre shapes. Like right here, this isn't a straight line across, so I'm going to go at a bit of an angle to clean that up for my next piece. And that's going to take me out of square, which is fine. But if you keep doing that, eventually you'll end up with like a big arch, or you'll have just a weird blob of fabric, which again is completely fine. It just depends on what your finished project is going to look like. Another thing that I find is really fun with crumb piecing is including the selvage edge. So whether it's printing, or I know some brands have like a really big selvage edge, and it's fun. Including those in crumb projects, I enjoy doing as well. So here I'm going to sew straight, and you can see there's a little bit sticking out. After I sew it, I'll just trim that away. As long as you have a straight edge to follow, you should be fine. Keep you on track. And you want it to be a straight edge just so that when you open it up, it's not like bowing because of a curve. That would be the only issue with that. Sometimes when I get really into it, I will, just put my new fabric down, sew across, and then trim it, flip it back. I get all kinds of weird angles. Or I might even, lay this down, and if this was more curved, just doing my best, sew a straight line. And then I'll just trim away from the seam however I need to. You might see some of this, but it doesn't here. This is a really fun project just to get really artistic with it. So there you can kind of see my seam. It's not a 1/4 inch from the edge, it's just kind of there. Once it's sewn though, you can trim it. That's it. So this is a really freeing project. Just grab all your random scraps, start sewing them together, and have fun with it. And one thing I find is really fun about this is you're using your own scraps, and you tend to gravitate towards your favorite colors when buying fabric. So naturally, you have curated a perfect color palette for your liking just in your scraps. You don't have to go buy any new fabrics. You can just, match up what you've already used, and you'll like it because it's colors you like because you bought the fabric. All right, let's do one more piece on here. We'll do this bright yellow. I'm feeling yellow today. Just trim away the excess. Press that up. There we go. So now with this, I can cut it into the shapes that I need for my quilt pattern. So I can just use my templates, depending on what pattern I'm making, and just cut it out. And a little messy on my desk here. One more cut. Perfect. And now I have a 6.5-inch square I can incorporate into my quilt that I didn't have to go buy any new fabric. I used all of my scraps. So not only did I save myself money, but I am working to clear out that huge pile that is just taking up space in my craft room. So that's the first method, just doing it kind of freehand. These stayed pretty much square, but like I said, you can add in weird angles if you have kind of funky shaped scraps. And then for method 2, if you followed me back in June, you saw the creation of the double wedding ring quilt that I have hanging behind me. And for that, to keep myself on track, so I didn't have to keep stopping and measuring my piece until I had it the right size, I used foundation paper. This is just a piece of scrap paper. It came from looks like a flower catalog that we get often. So it could be just magazines, newspapers, junk mail, whatever. We're being resourceful with our resources. You do want something though that is thinner, easy to tear, and then we just start sewing. For this method, it's best to start in the center and work your way out towards the edges. I'm going to start with a smaller piece. It's kind of log cabin style, almost starting from the center, adding strips to the outside edges as you go. And when using junk mail, I would say probably test a piece, like ironing it on the fabric just to make sure there's no ink transfer. I have not had that happen with anything so far, but something to be mindful of. And with this, again, you'll want to make sure that your stitch length is a little shorter. It's going to hold everything together and make it easier to tear the paper after. So back in July, I was on with Sewing Parts Online and we did foundation paper piecing. This is pretty much that same method, except you don't have a pattern that you're following. This is all just kind of freeform. But you have the paper to help you keep on track so you know when you're done for your size of piece that you need. And because we are just kind of sewing willy-nilly, our grain lines are going to end up going every which way. So this is going to help stabilize as you're sewing. Okay, so here I've attached this piece. That's my 1/4-inch seam, and you can see I have this hanging off the edge. Now I don't want to just take this to my cutting table and trim that, because then I'm going to cut the paper. So you can fold the paper back, and you might have to tug at the stitches a little, but you can fold it back and then safely cut the excess without cutting the papers. Grab another piece. If you're really bored and you want to get really into it, you can start using smaller and smaller scraps. And you'll get a really fun, very busy, intricate look. I find a lot of fun to look at quilts that have done this and used tiny little pieces of fabric. You can start searching and see if maybe you see just like a tiny little heart or a little flower, whatever was included in the print. I'm going to trim this away, so I'll just pull at those stitches a little bit. Trim away that. Sometimes I get a little ahead of myself and I'll start just finger pressing my seams as I go rather than going to the iron. But having the little mini iron here is super helpful.
Donna would like to know if you can do this on your serger as well.
You probably could. I have not, but because you are just doing straight lines straight across, I don't see why you could.
Awesome. And then to shamelessly plug, because I know you love the machine and I love this machine so much, what machine are you sewing on?
It is my Juki TL2010Q, and I do love it.
I also want to ask about your wish table. We sent that to you after July.
Yep.
How are you feeling about it? Do you like it? Do you use it pretty often?
Oh, it is. It's a permanent feature now. It's always on. I did
Awesome.
take the drawer out just for the video. I figured it'd be a little distracting, but there's that blue drawer with all the accessories that slides in there. And I like to keep like my spare needles and my screwdriver, all that kind of stuff in there, so it's readily available.
Awesome. I'm glad you like it, because I'm considering getting one for myself too. I'm thinking about getting the Wish, obviously, but also for the free motion or the angle one. Do you do any free motion on your wish table? And if so, do you find that it helps, or do you think it'd be better to get the one that's actually for free motion?
I have not done any free motion on it yet. Since I have the long arm, I just default to using that for all of my quilting. But I have used it doing some straight line quilting with a walking foot, and that has been nice because it's more surface area. I have liked
awesome.
it for that.
Thanks, Chris.
You're welcome. So when you are ironing using the foundation paper, you do want to make sure you are not using any steam, because steam and paper do not play well together. Plugging along, almost done with this square. So like I said before, this was the method that I used to make my double wedding ring quilt. That one had 220 of the arch pieces that I needed to make crumbs for. And by the end of it, I swore I would never do crumb quilting again, but also I am kind of loving the crumb quilting. So, you know, if you have a large project, I would say just do it in little spurts so you don't burn yourself out too quickly. But it's a lot of fun because each block is different and you can just try different color combinations and all sorts of fun stuff. You can do some blocks that have teeny tiny little crumbs, some blocks that have larger crumbs, some that's a mix. There's really no rules with it.
Some people want to know what the advantage to using paper is.
So the paper helps me keep on track for the size that I need. So I don't have to keep stopping and measuring, like, do I need to add a little to this side, a little to that side? I could quickly see where I need to have coverage. And then when you start getting into different angles, it helps keep it stable while you're sewing the next piece on. Because like this one, the grain's going this way, grain's going this way, grain's going at an angle here. It can get a little crazy, especially when working with smaller pieces.
Do you find that you have to use any type of needle with the paper?
I just use my regular needle. I probably have too big of a needle right now, actually, because I was making a hat and I forgot to switch it back out to my normal. I usually sew with a 12 or a 14, and this is a 16.
Gotcha.
All right, well, I'm not going to finish this one, but it gives you a pretty good idea of how to do it. Press it back. When trimming your seams, you don't have to be a perfect 1/4 of an inch. Because it's already sewn, it's not going to affect anything. But I would say make sure you don't have a lot of excess, because then that just adds additional bulk to your quilt when you're done. So there you can see where the paper is. Like, I can tell I need to do a little more in this corner and a little more in this corner, but the top 2 edges, I'm done. They're fully covered. So whatever I make out of this, I have a large enough piece. So that's method number 2, using some foundation paper. Method 3 is using foundation fabric. So it's done pretty much the same way, except you're using fabric instead of paper. Paper, when you're done, you're going to come back and tear it out. And because you've shortened your stitch length, it all tears out pretty easily. Using thinner paper like newsprint also helps it tear out really easily. So you can just make a pile of that, throw it in your recycling. But then using foundation fabric, it just stays in there permanent. This is a good thing you can do if you have some fabric that you don't love, or if you have a fabric that you are just sick of looking at because you've made 7,000 projects with it and just whatever you do can't get to the end of the bolt. I know we've all experienced that. Or this fabric, you maybe can see in camera, has a little bit of discoloration. Like, it looks like it maybe had some water damage. So if you're using like stained fabric, I would probably pre-wash it just to make sure that whatever the stain is isn't going to bleed onto your pretty fabric. But you can use this as your foundation. Grab this piece. We'll start there. So again, we're just going to start somewhat in the middle and work our way out from there. As I go along, I usually just kind of rough cut the edges. One reason is I could put these pieces back into my pile to keep adding on. But 2, it's just less to handle as I'm spinning it around and adding new pieces on. So when using the foundation fabric, because it is going to stay and become a permanent part of your quilt, it's going to add some additional weight and bulk. So that is something to consider. If you have a lighter weight fabric, that would be ideal. You can always go get some just like cheap cotton muslin to use as the backing if you don't already have some fabric that you want to use. But it'll add to the overall weight, which could be a good thing if you're trying to go for a really warm quilt. You could use maybe then a thinner batting since you already have that extra layer of fabric. All right. All right, let's get some color in here. So I don't know where it is. I have it somewhere in my house here, but I made a string quilt using foundation fabric like this. And I honestly did not notice too much of the difference with having the additional fabric as far as like bulk goes. But string quilting, if you're not familiar, is very similar to crumb quilting, except that you're using just strips of fabric. So you would sew them side by side, and it could be varying widths of whatever, scrap strips you have left. A string is usually around 1 inch to 1.5 inches. Again, you don't want to go much lower than 1 inch because you won't be able to see it in the finished quilt once you have a 1/4 inch taken on both sides. So I'm going to call this one done. It has larger pieces, but I want to be conscious of time. So I'm going to now trim this to my 6.5 inches. And because this is foundation fabric, that fabric is just going to stay in place. Okay, so we have our crumb piece square ready to go. That's all fine and dandy. What are you going to do with it, though? I'm actually going to turn this one into a half square triangle. So I have another square of the same size, and I already drew my line from corner to corner, and I'll sew a 1/4 inch on each side. Now, since this is, kind of all over the place, I need to decide, do I want to cut it this way or do I want to cut it this way? I think I'm going to do it this way. Really no wrong answer, just something to consider when you are lacing it. And I think yesterday Ellie showed this method as well for doing 2 at a time half square triangles, and also 8 at a time half square triangles, where you would draw a second line and sew 4 stitches total, and then you cut it crosswise and on the lines, and you end up with 8 half square triangles. Easy peasy. So, and flip it around and sew up the other side. I definitely felt a bump there in the middle. I have a sample I'll be showing in a second, and I ended up switching to my walking foot where I had 2 crumb pieces that I was sewing together, because sometimes your seams just land right on top of each other. It can get a little bulky. There we go. All right, so now here's 1 half square triangle, and here's the second one. Press these back. Again, with crumb piecing, I just like to let the seams go wherever they want to go and press them down. So this one I'm going towards the solid piece here because that has no seams to contend with. And when I'm pairing crumb pieces up with I say a solid piece of fabric, but as in, it's not a pieced piece of fabric, not necessarily a solid color. I do like to have it be either a solid color or a low volume print, because the crumb pieces, you really want them to shine. You put a lot of work into them, so you want them to stand out and not get confused with the other half of the triangle. If this was also like, a busy print, it might just look like it was part of your crumb piecing. So So there we go. So here, we have 2 half square triangles. There's tons of patterns that you can do with half square triangles. And for today, like I used all different fabrics. Like I wasn't keeping in any kind of theme or color scheme, but that is another option that you can do. So let me switch my camera and I'll show you what you can do with some of your crumb piecing. This is all fine and dandy, but if you don't actually use them, you haven't really accomplished anything. You're trying to get rid of your scraps. You're trying to use them, make them usable, keep them out of the landfill, what have you. But if you're just making, bigger crumb pieces that then sit in your scrap bin or your fabric stash somewhere for years and years and years, you haven't gotten ahead at all. Like I said, today I just used random fabrics. No rhyme or reason, nice and crazy. That's what I did here with this double wedding ring. So all of those arches and most of the cornerstones where they joined together was all crumb pieced. Random fabric. Also, I used some orphan blocks that I've had sitting around for years. Again, just taking up space, collecting dust. So I used my AccuQuilt to make this. I just threw them on the die, cut them out in the arches. So like this was an orphan block, that was an orphan block. Don't be afraid to cut up those things that are sitting in your craft room, taking up space. Make them something usable that you can enjoy. Like I remember what those blocks looked like because I either made them or they were gifted to me from a friend and they've been staring at me for years. But now I have a usable, functional piece of art that honors those blocks. Another thing you can do when making your crumb blocks is keeping them within a color family. So here, like these were all pieced with red. These were all pieced with orange. And together, I made this fun 8-pointed star. And you can tell between the different colors, like pink, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, black. So now this is a huge block. This ended at 24 inches because it was that same 6-inch half square triangle. I think I might make 3 more and do like a big throw out of them. I haven't decided, but I love how this turned out. I made this the other night on TikTok Live. Some of you may have joined in watching that. So that's one thing you can do with it. Just use it to replace, like use all the same color and use it to replace if I needed a green square. I'll just make a green crumb square and use that in place of whatever it is I needed. You can also make functional items out of it. So in my little teaser for this, I made a crumb panel to use to make a hat. So I just pulled a bunch of different scraps out of my black bin, crumb pieced them together. Let's see if my light, there we go. And then quilted them to make this fun hat. And on this hat, I also used scraps to kind of fill in some of my, like the back panels and straps and brim. So lots of fun things you can do with scraps. Any questions for me, Brian?
I do have a question. It's not related to the crumb quilt. Well, kind of, sort of. It's related to the double wedding ring in the back. So I've been talking about my friend Deb Porter a lot, and I know that she started making a double wedding ring quilt for her husband, Tim, who's been asking her for one for a long time. But she basically wants to throw her sewing machine out of a moving vehicle because she's getting so frustrated with them. Do you have tips and tricks, or was there anything like when you started doing double wedding ring quilts that helped you perfect them, get better at them?
Yes. So I actually did a little video series, and I think it's all included. I did a full YouTube, like a full length YouTube video making this quilt, and I tried 4 methods for piecing the curves. I did a method where you start at the center and you pin all the way around. And now remember, there's 220 arches in this quilt. It's a lot of pinning. So you could pin and then sew. You can use sewing clips and then sew. You can use the Acorn Precision Seam Glue. And so you can like do little glue dots and get it in place before you go sew it. Or you can just freehand it. And at the beginning of the quilt, I think I was most fond of the pins because it was the most accurate. But by the end of the quilt, I had done so many curves that I was just freehanding them all. And they were coming out just fine. So a lot of it is practice. You know, quilting is an art form. It takes practice. And then just getting to know your machine, your 1/4-inch seam, whether you're using a 1/4-inch foot or a guide on your machine, you know, getting comfortable with that. And then just keep going. Some of these arches aren't great, but they're still in there. And you know, you can't really point them out. There's so much going on that any mistake kind of gets lost in the crazy.
Awesome. Well, thank you for answering that for her. And everybody in the comments, if you could shout Deb Porter out some love and support and let her know that she can do it. She is capable. Just Practice, practice, practice.
Yes.
Okay, so there was a couple other questions that were pertaining to other stuff. I know that you like to make quilts like with minky backing and stuff like that. You like to think outside the box. How do you feel about using old bed sheets for backing?
This one doesn't have it. I have several that have vintage bed sheets for backing. I love them. I do try to find 100% cotton, but that's getting harder and harder to find at the thrift stores. So if it is a polyester blend, I'll use it sometimes, but just, if I love the print. I will say though that IKEA uses 100% cotton in their duvet covers and sheets and stuff. So you find something from IKEA, you're almost guaranteed it's 100% cotton.
Oh, well, that's a little quilting life hack. Thank you for that. Do you want to take a moment, because we're really excited that we're carrying your patterns now.
Yes.
We started out as friends on TikTok, and then you became an ambassador, and now we're carrying Chris Marchini's patterns. So I'm going to bring up an overlay which has a couple of them on there. Do you want to talk about your patterns and kind of what inspired you and how people can use them?
So the one there in the upper left, that pattern just launched today. That's my Ripple Bloom. And for that, so each pattern I write, I try to challenge myself for a new technique or to learn something new. But with Ripple Bloom, I was really trying to write a beginner-friendly pattern that had a lot of impact. On my website, I do have a free download that's called My First Quilt. And it's actually, I debuted that and demoed it here on SewCreative Live, I think last year or earlier this year. I don't know. They're all blending together. I've done so many. So that's a great introduction if you've never sewn before. But once you're getting a little more confident, this quilt, it looks super complicated. Like there's so many triangles and points, but it's deceptively simple. Once you get sewing it together, there's very few points to match up. It's really just up and down the center, like where the centers come together and you actually have like a flying geese looking unit. Those are really the only ones you have to match up. With like the death moth there, I was trying to, that's actually the largest quilt I've ever designed. It's a king size quilt. And I was just trying to get detail in the moth and get some movement in it. And that's my normal style of quilt pattern, the moth there. I have the moth, a poison apple, a skull, mushrooms, and it's very mosaic looking. I use different sizes of squares and rectangles mixed together. So you get an inherently scrappy look. And like if you look, you'd have to look at it for a while to kind of find out where the seams are, because there are no Y seams and no partial seams in my patterns because I hate them. I have it all kind of laid out like a jigsaw puzzle to piece it all together, all straight seams. But when you first look at it, you're like, oh, dang, that's like a lot of pieces coming together, and it can get a little crazy.
Well, we're super excited to have them. If people want to learn more from you and support your small business, how can they do that?
So I am on pretty much all of the social medias. So I'm on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and Threads. I'm kind of on there. And I post almost daily. I'll post a video, whether it's just a project I'm working on, tips and tricks for how to do your binding or how to make a half square triangle, different things like that. I'm just really big on sharing a free information out there. I'm under Rose City Originals on all the platforms.
Awesome. Well, Chris, we are so grateful that you joined us. We are so grateful that you're a Sewing Parts Online ambassador and our friend. And every time you come on and we see you on social media and stuff, we just think, man, Chris has such a bright future ahead of him. If this is where he's at now, we can't even imagine what it's going to be like in 5-10 years. I think you're going to take the quilting industry by storm. And we really we love you very much. So
thank you.
With that said, enjoy the rest of your weekend and we'll chat soon sometime.
You as well. Thank you.